So welcome. I'm pleased that that you've come to hear about Walter Harper. He is a person who has become very close to my heart. I think some people, including my husband, might think that I'm rather obsessed with him. He was quite a remarkable person, and so tonight I'll share with you a little bit about what made me think that this was really a story that should be told and that would resonate with folks. I'll tell you a little bit about his life, and then I'll just have some final reflections for you, and then I'm very happy to entertain your questions. So let's see. So Walter Harper's life story, I see four main categories of values in his life story. First of all, it sheds light on an era in Alaska history when Western immigrants and culture were inundating Alaska Native peoples and cultures, and the effects of the new belief systems and products and habits and diseases ranged from liberating to crushing. It also illustrates the efforts of the Episcopal Mission Church to protect Native peoples from the harms brought by Western migrants. At the same time that the mission workers also introduced change naturally. It also demonstrates the capacity for human interaction to maximize the individual's potential. And here I'm getting at this relationship between Walter and his mentor, father figure, the Episcopal Archdeacon Hudson Stuck. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that relationship and how it allowed Walter to really become so much more, I think, than he might have, and to build so much more potential than he might have had these two people not encountered one another. And finally, it really exemplifies resilience in a young man whose physical, mental, and moral excellence reflected acculturation in both Athabascan and Western lifeways. And as such, I think that he stands as just a wonderful model for people, for young people, but really for anybody the world over, because who isn't mixed race nowadays, right? And some young people, though, I think really struggle with figuring out who they are and what direction they want to take. And Walter did such a beautiful job of that I really just think that he's a wonderful role model in that way. So, whoops, I'm not going to go there yet. So I thought what I'd focus on tonight is to talk to you a little bit about why I thought his story would resonate so well with Alaska Natives and non-Natives, with Alaskans and people anywhere in the world, with young and old, with people from all walks of life. So when I approached the University of Nebraska Press about publishing this work, Matt Bockavoy, who became my editor there, told me, well, there's good news and bad news. Well, the bad news was that history books weren't selling that well lately. But the good news was that biographies were up. Sales of biographies were up. And so this was a biography, so that was good news for me. And so you know, just thinking about this, why is it that biographies are so appealing to me? I mean, to anybody. And I think that it's something about, perhaps, that we as individuals can identify with other individuals, and so that maybe learning about history through the lives of individuals of the past, it just resonates better, and we can relate to these stories better and enjoy learning the history better than when we read books that attempt to convey the experiences of the collective, of the masses. I think we as individuals relate to other individuals, their struggles, their foibles, their triumphs, their tragedies. I think that maybe we like to experience other people's adventures vicariously. Perhaps we long for heroes. We like to read about people. We can admire people who inspire us. And personally, I think it's just so satisfying to read about a life well lived. And as I came to know Walter through the words and the publications of Hudson Stuck, the Episcopal Archdeacon Hudson Stuck, I just thought that, oh my goodness, this is such a remarkable story. This was such a remarkable young man. His story really should be told. His story should be known. His story will resonate with people and inspire people and perhaps guide young people and help them to find their way in life. So what was it in particular that was so appealing about Walter? Well, he just had so many traits that I think we just instinctively admire. Incredible charisma. His sister wrote that the girls were just, crazy about him. He had this incredible sense of such a strong sense of purpose and direction and a strong sense of identity. And he had this quiet self-confidence about him that just put him at ease with others. He was a master at wilderness skills, or subsistence skills as we tend to call them. And at the same time, he had no ego that got in the way of relationships with others or was off-putting to others. Instead, he had this incredible warmth and generous spirit and geniality that just seemed to bring people together. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about his life and not give away the whole story so that you don't feel maybe interested in reading the book itself, but tell you just enough to pique your interest and have you maybe be curious to know more about him. So this is Walter here. I love this photograph of him. It's not a very good quality one, as you can see, but I liked it because even though he's sort of scowling and looking very serious, this is the way I picture him being most at ease and most comfortable and happiest when he's out on the land. I was going to say, but the editors of the book, they chose this photograph because the image was very good quality, and Matt Bokovoy convinced me that the cover of books the covers are very, very important, and they have to have that kind of appeal that makes a person pick up a book and look at it and want to read it. So we went with this one, which I love too. But I just know that Walter preferred to be dressed like this rather than like that. Nevertheless, he does look pretty darn handsome in his coat there. All right, so who was Walter Harper? Well, Walter Harper was the 8th child of Arthur and Jenny Harper. And Arthur Harper was an Irish immigrant. He came to America when he was just 14 years old. He fled the Irish potato famine and came to the East Coast and eventually worked his way west and did some prospecting in the West, and then eventually worked his way up to Alaska and made his way all the way up actually following the rivers to Fort Yukon, and then ended up being a prospector and trader for, till almost the end of his life. And he became a legendary figure, and in fact, William Ogilvie, who was the commissioner of the Yukon during the Klondike Gold Rush, credited Arthur Harper with being the person more than any other who was the first to recognize the potential of the Alaska and Yukon gold field. And he did call it one gold field because, the line at the 141st parallel is rather arbitrary. And so in terms of geology, it is one gold field, Alaska and the Yukon. So Jenny then, or Sintana, was just 14 years old when these two met, and Arthur was 39. And that sounds shocking to us now, but at the time it wasn't that shocking. It wouldn't have brought out the police or anything, So they married, and in 1874, the year after Arthur arrived in Alaska, and they were together for 20 years and produced 8 children, of whom Walter was the youngest. And one noteworthy thing, or point worth mentioning, is that when each child reached the age of about 5 or 6, school age, in other words, Arthur, against Jenny's objections, sent those children outside to school. Now, this was not an entirely unusual thing to do. People who had the means to do so, and if they were non-native, some of them wanted their children to get, a proper education outside. So by his standards, that he was being a good father doing that, but we can understand how hard that must have been on Jenny. Well, when Walter was 2.5, the couple separated, and Jenny returned to Nuku'alofa, or Tanana, as it's now known, with Walter, and she raised him in the Athabascan tradition. So he alone of these 8 siblings really grew up in the Athabascan tradition, developing subsistence skills at a very young age, and becoming very adept in these skills, really becoming incredibly adept in these skills. So when Walter was 15 years old, he was at a fishing camp, a family fishing camp, and the Episcopal Archdeacon Hudson came along and must have seen something in him, and so he convinced Jenny to allow him to take Walter to St. Mark's Mission School at Nenana. That was an Episcopal mission school, and where it became kind of a mission school and orphanage where the Episcopal Church looked after children and schooled children, and became kind of a community center, actually. So who was Archdeacon Hudson Stuck? Well, he was a British-born Episcopal pastor who came to Alaska in 1904, answered a call for a mission worker, and very soon thereafter he was given the title of Archdeacon of the Yukon and the areas to the north of there, or something like that, and that meant the Yukon River. And so in winter and summer he traveled along the Yukon River and its tributaries, mainly the Tanana and the Koyukuk, visiting the Episcopal missions there, and also visiting native fish camps and villages, and later mining camps too. And just seeing to people's needs, medical, spiritual, social, all kinds of needs. And he began looking, once the mission was established at St. Mark's in Nenana, he began looking for promising Native youth who might go to the school there and develop a Western education that could help them to become leaders. But I want to make one point about that's very important to understand about the work that the Episcopal Church did. And I should just, as a disclaimer, tell you that I'm not Episcopalian. I was not raised in the Episcopal Church, but I have come to be quite, I am very impressed with the work that the Episcopal Church did in interior Alaska, because people like Hudson Stuck in particular did not try to assimilate. They had no interest in assimilating Alaska Natives into white culture. Quite the opposite, in fact. They did have assimilative effects in that they were bringing Christianity and they were bringing Western education and Western medicine, but for the most part, they wanted the Athabascans in the interior to stay away from those low-down white men and others who were bringing a lot of nasty habits into the area, and who were sort of luring some Athabascans away from their traditional life ways, very much to their detriment. So, so anyway, these two, so Hudson Stuck did take Walter to the mission St. Mark's at Nenana, and Walter was there just a year. He thrived there. He was very well liked and very much admired by the other children for his subsistence skills. And after 1 year, then by the following spring, the Archdeacon hired Walter as his traveling companion and trail guide and riverboat pilot and interpreter. And so these two became, over the years, over the following 8 years, they became quite close. They developed a close mentor-tutor relationship and eventually quite a close father-son relationship. So they, summers they spent on the Pelican. Here you see on your left a photograph of the Pelican there, which was the mission, the Episcopal mission boat. And Walter learned to drive that, and he was a master pilot of that boat. Very, very impressive mechanical skills that he developed. During the winter, they were on the trail with the dogs and the dog sleds, and he was very masterful at that sort of travel too. And in fact, one of the things that I really discovered was that Walter's skills enabled Hudson Stuck to be a much more effective archdeacon, much more effective in his role than he ever could have been without this kind of assistance. First of all, just the physical skill set that he had, but also Walter, as he interpreted and as he acted sort of as go-between between the archdeacon and the Athabascan people, Walter in a certain way sort of endorsed the words of the archdeacon and sort of let his people know that, you know, this is a good guy, you should be trusting him. And people came to trust Walter very much and respect him very much, and also the archdeacon was very, very well respected. So it was a relationship that was really mutually beneficial to the two of them. So here's a map that shows the area that they're covered. It was really huge. It was really huge. The vast interior of Alaska, Athabascan country, is the largest region of the state. If you've seen that map that Michael Krause created of Alaska Native cultures and peoples, you know that big area in the middle that's kind of orangey, that's the Athabascan country. It's really large. And then we also know, Fairbanksans know, that this is Doyon country too. So here you can see the Yukon River that comes from the Yukon territory and flows up to as far as the Arctic Circle at Fort Yukon, and then it flows down toward the Bering Sea. And so there were lots of little communities along the Yukon River and along the tributaries to the Yukon, in particular the Tanana and the Koyukuk, that Walter and the archdeacon traveled together in winter and summer. So they were working together and traveling together for about 2 years when Hudson Stuck's long-held dream of summiting Denali seemed to be falling into place. He finally had convinced the rugged outdoorsman Harry Karstens to co-lead an expedition to summit Denali. And of course, by this time, it was entirely clear that Walter would be a part of the team because he had become completely indispensable to Hudson Stuck. And then they recruited a fourth person for the ascent team, and that was Robert Tatum, who was a divinity student. And so the ascent team consisted here, we see most of them, well, all of them except, well, we see the ascent team here, including from left, Robert Tatum in the middle, Harry Karstens, and then Walter at the far right. And then the two younger boys in the middle are Isaias George and Johnny Fredson, who assisted the team and freighted a lot of their supplies up to the base camp and then even to the next camp up on Muldrow Glacier. So this was the first successful summit of Denali, quite a remarkable feat. The mountain had never, it had never been summited before because it was such a daunting task. And so Stuck and Harry Karstens co-led this team, but the truth is, once they were on the mountain, Harry Karstens was the tactical leader on the expedition. However, Hudson Stuck was a much more famous person than Harry Karstens, and Hudson Stuck was very literate, and he published a lot, and he published an account of the ascent called Ascent of Denali. And in that, he actually gave a lot of credit to Harry Karstens, but he also played up his own role, naturally, in the ascent. And at the end of the day, much more credit was given to the Archdeacon than to anyone else on the team. And this was very much to Harry Karstens' irritation. Actually, he had become very irritated annoyed with the Archdeacon well before that, almost as soon as the ascent began. Their relationship became rather rocky, and so Walter played a really important role in diffusing tension and moving the project forward. But I have this statement of Hudson Stuck's about Walter's performance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But just here I have, so he wrote in Ascent of Denali, 21 years old, 6 feet tall, he took gleefully to high mountaineering, while his kindliness and invincible amiability endeared him to every member of the party. So the biggest challenge on the mountain was this northeast ridge, which they anticipated, which took them all the way up to the highest reaches of the mountain before the final stretch up to the peak. And they expected it would be about a 2-day trek over rather a smooth ridge, because that was the report that they had gotten from the team that had attempted the summit the year before. But since that attempt the year before, in fact, right after it, a horrendous earthquake had occurred that had just brought down all kinds of snow and ice onto this northeast ridge, so they didn't even recognize it when they first saw it. And rather than being a 2-day trek up this rather smooth ridge, it turned out to be a 3-week ordeal during which mostly Walter and Harry Karstens chopped with their axes every step of the way in a 3-mile path up that ridge over these boulders of ice that Harry Karstens said were as big as houses sometimes. So that was where, it was at that stretch of the climb when Walter's qualities really shone, both his incredible physical strength and stamina and his just remarkable good humor, stoicism, pleasantness, and just his ability to just stay on task and not become irritated. So I really see in the end. Oh, so I meant to say that. So I told you that the Archdeacon got most of the credit back in the day, and for many decades, for almost a century actually, he got most of the credit for this remarkable feat. Well, in 2013, Tom Walker published a book about Harry Karstens called The 70-Mile Kid, and in that he worked to rectify the record and clarify the very important, the key role that Harry Karstens played in this, and he gave a lot of credit to Walter too. But as I examined the record, I really find that not to diminish at all what Harry Karstens did or what anybody else did, but I really see Walter as the linchpin in this expedition. And that is because of this remarkable combination of extraordinary wilderness skills, incredible strength, and this exuberant personality that was just almost always sunny and just helped others to get along and move the project forward. So initially the team was quite exuberant and lighthearted, and Walter and Johnny and Isaias were hunting for food and having a grand old time and frolicking and pulling pranks and so on. But as the challenges mounted, conflicts arose, and there was like extreme tension between Karstens and Stuck, and there were blowouts and arguments and screaming and things like that. And in fact, I'm reminded. So we have Dick Hatton in the audience here, and I remember you're telling us. So I don't know. Some of you may know Dick Hatton, that he and Roger Siglin and some other companions have traveled many times over the Canadian Barrens, and anyway, done long expeditions on snow machine, and Dick came to my classes several times and talked to my students about this, and I remember so well he's saying, you really want to pick your team members well, because you get to know each other very well on such expeditions, and sometimes you find out more than you really want to know about certain people. So I thought of that as I was doing this research, Dick, just so you know. But anyway, so Walter just had this amazing ability to just remain cheerful, or at least stoic, and very non-confrontational. And then his strength and stamina just kept the team moving ahead. So even now, Harry Karstens and Hudson Stuck hardly agreed on anything. It's difficult to find anything they agreed on. But I found in this wonderful letter that Karstens wrote to his good friend, the naturalist Charles Sheldon, where he told his account of what really happened on the mountain. And he wrote of Walter, the deacon's boy Walter was a good one, 21 years old, strong, fearless, and fine and lovable disposition as I ever saw in a man. He was my main standby. So there you have, confirmation of just this, of just the really that critical role that Walter played in this remarkable feat. So after they summited the mountain on June 7th, and then spent the rest of the summer in Alaska. That was 1913. And then Walter went outside for 3 years to a Christian-based school in Massachusetts, where he was going to get a Western education that would help him to come back and be a leader among his people in Alaska. And while he was there, he adapted quite well. In the end, he missed home an awful lot, and he did struggle sometimes with the studies, because he had only had about a total of 3 years of formal education, and most of it wasn't that formal. It was tutoring by Hudson Stuck. But anyway, after 3 years, it was time to come home. He did not graduate, but most students didn't graduate at that time from Mount Hermon. And so he returned to Alaska. Oh, I had to throw in this photograph because I just had to have a good, well, I didn't have a good excuse, I just wanted to, because it's such a beautiful photograph of him that was taken during those years at Mount Hermon. And so just a little bit of eye candy for folks. He was an incredibly handsome man on top of everything else. But yeah, so after 3 years, during those 3 years at Mount Hermon, he determined that he wanted to become a medical missionary and serve the people of Alaska's interior. And so that was his plan when he left there, and that was going to require some intense work, some intense further tutoring by Hudson Stuck. And then in a couple more years, when he was more prepared, he planned to go outside to college and then medical school, and then return to Alaska as a medical missionary. So in the meantime, he did return to Alaska. Whoops, we can't get ahead to that quite yet. He returned to Alaska and resumed his role as the Archdeacon's right-hand man. And that was in 1916. And in 1917, this woman, Frances Wells, arrived in Fort Yukon from Philadelphia, where she had trained to be a nurse. And so she came to Fort Yukon, to the newly opened hospital there, as a missionary nurse. And she fell in love with Alaska, and she fell in love with the Athabascan people and her work here. And it wasn't very long before she had fallen in love with Walter Harper. No big surprise. Their relationship didn't get a lot of encouragement because, well, Hudson had no patience for romance. You know, he had this plan for Walter, and Walter was going to go to medical school, and Walter, you know, and he was going to be a long time in school. And so he told Frances at one point, Frances was 4 years older than Walter, by the way. And so he told her that, well, she should think of Walter as a brother, because by the time he got back from medical school, she would probably be 40 years old. So that was a bit of an exaggeration. But anyway, there was no discouraging them. Walter and Hudson Stuck went on a final journey in the winter of 1917-18. They traveled from Fort Yukon. You can see it here. Well, I don't have a pointer, but can you see Fort Yukon over here to the left and at the Arctic Circle? Over here, Fort Yukon, they traveled out to the Arctic coast to Kotzebue, and then followed the coastline up to Point Hope, where they spent 7 wonderful weeks at the Episcopal mission there, and then on up to Barrow, where they spent 2 more weeks having a grand old time, hosted by Charlie Brower, and then they traveled. This is all by dog sled, of course, having amazing adventures in Inupiat territory. This is very different for Walter, who was used to Alaska's interior, which had a very different landscape. So anyway, they traveled all the way over past the demarcation point, and then finally back down to Fort Yukon. Well, in that final leg of the journey, Walter showed his diary to Hudson Stuck, and in that diary, and Hudson Stuck read it from cover to cover, and in doing so, he learned that Walter had made some plans that Stuck hadn't been aware of yet. And it turns out that Walter and Frances were now committed to being married. And Walter planned to join the Army Air Corps, because this is 1918 now, and the Great War had been going on for some time. And Walter had learned up at Point Barrow that Alaska Native men were now eligible to sign up for military service. They hadn't been eligible earlier, believe it or not, when the call went out for Alaska Natives, and I guess other Native Americans were not encouraged to join. But he learned that 2 of Charlie Brower's sons, who were half Inupiat, had enlisted and were serving over there, and so he realized that he could too. So he was going to join the Army Air Corps, and he was going to marry Frances. Well, Hudson Stuck didn't take that super well, but eventually he did come around, and on September 4 of that year of 1918, he married the couple in the chapel there at Fort Yukon. And so they planned then to go outside, and they would go off to Europe. She was going to become a Red Cross nurse, and they were very much needed. And he was going to join the Army Air Corps. The very day that they left Fort Yukon, they learned that an armistice was in the works, and so they would not have to serve over there. And so they left Alaska very lighthearted and thinking he would be able to go to college right away. And so they were headed for Pennsylvania for Walter to meet her family. And very tragically, they boarded the Princess Sophia in Skagway. And that very night, the ship, in a blinding snowstorm, ran aground. And after 44 hours on a reef, perched on this the ship was knocked off the reef by a huge wave, and a big gash was cut in the hull of the ship, and icy waters rushed in, and the boiler exploded, and every single person aboard perished. And so over 350 people, that was the worst maritime disaster in Alaska's history. And so ended this this remarkable life and this incredible potential that this young man showed. And so he didn't have the legacy that I'm so confident that he would have had he lived to a ripe old age. I'll just share with you this. This was a staggering blow to Hudson's Duck. This was the son he never had. So after a few months, he was finally able to write to officials at Mount Herman to notify them of Walter's death. And so he wrote, "It has been a terrible blow to me. He was as a son to me. He has left behind him a sweet memory and the light of a bright example. He was at once the strongest and the gentlest, the cleanest and the most amiable youth I have ever known, the fine flower of the mixed blood. At the same time, he was the best shot, the best dog driver, the best hand with any sort of boat, from a birch bark canoe to a power launch, the most resourceful and capable man I have known in Alaska." And so, quite what a loss. I mean, there were of course, over 300 people, 350 people who were no doubt equally cherished by their loved ones. But when I think of Walter's life and what was lost there, I think of just so much potential. And in fact, had he lived to a ripe old age, he would have lived through the land claims era. And in fact, many of us in this room would have known him and respected him well. And that's quite a remarkable thing to think about, I think. So I forgot to mention that this photograph, I don't know this, but I like to think that was taken on their wedding day, because it's the most mature looking photograph that I have of Walter, and he looks so happy there, and he's all duded up, So anyway, I just love that photograph because he just looks so happy there. So anyway, I wanted to just conclude with some thoughts about how Walter Harper's life is meaningful. And I've thought a lot about this and how his life seems to exemplify the human factor that explains so much about outcomes and experiences and a great number of social phenomena. So in the social sciences and humanities, we tend to deal with human experiences and human relationships that oftentimes can't be quantified. And the human factor explains so much about how we interact with others, whether individuals or groups succeed, whether they meet their goals, whether they thrive, whether we want someone to be on our team or in our workplace, whether workplaces or family relationships or friendships are happy and affirmative and productive, or whether they're kind of bumpy or negative or even sometimes almost toxic. The human factor explains so much about whether we have good or bad experiences and whether we brighten or sort of dampen the lives of others and their hopes and their dreams. And so I just think that Walter Harper exemplifies all of that. And so how a person can spread joy, lighten others' burdens, bring others together in common cause. So despite his, this is it's such a tragedy that his life ended so early. He was just 25 and Francis was 29 when they perished. Such an incredible loss of potential there. And yet, this is a feel-good story. It's an inspiring story. And why is that? And I think it's because it's so, it's just so wonderful to read about and to know people who do inspire us, I think, who live their lives well and who can sort of be kind of a beacon to the rest of us and just make us feel good about maybe ourselves or the way we want to be. So to me, so the thing about Denali, it's a great hook. And if someone wants to know, well, who is Walter Harper? Well, of course I say, well, he was the first person to summit Denali. But really, to me, it's just a hook. And it wasn't his summiting Denali that attracted me so much to him and that made me think, this story has to be told. People have to know about him. Young people need to know about this guy and just what a remarkable person he was and how he navigated so well in both his Athabascan culture and the Western culture that he came to know through his mentor and father figure, Hudson Stuck. I just think that's really, really much more remarkable than the ascent itself. Although, okay, that's pretty cool. That's pretty admirable. So, yeah. So I just think that. That's the story of Walter Harper, that this person who had a way of inspiring and bringing people together and lifting people's hearts and smoothing the raw edges off of relationships and moving projects forward. And I just imagine that if he had lived a good long life, I am so confident that whether he became a medical missionary or not, he would have been a great leader. And I'm just so certain that he would have been a wonderful bridge between natives and non-natives, helping us to understand one another better. He could have been a great leader during the land claims era. And yet now I think, well, since his story is out there now, maybe he can have that legacy that he should have had that he earned. So I just wanted to leave it at that and would entertain your questions, but I wanted to make one final comment, and that is that I really do feel privileged to know Walter Harper. I feel like I know him really well, and I'm very glad for that. And I just want to note that it was important to me that the Harper family knew of this project, and I hoped very much that they would endorse the project and that they would feel good about it and would feel that my rendering of this history met with their expectations and their vision of this member of their family, whom they are very proud of. And that has turned out very well. I contacted a schoolmate of mine from Denali School, Johanna Harper, first, and she was very pleased that I was taking this on, and she contacted other families and got back to me and said, oh, everybody's so happy that you've done this. And later Phyllis Fast, her cousin, who's one of Walter's great nieces also, and an anthropologist. She was an anthropologist at UAA. She read the manuscript for me and gave me some really helpful feedback. So I was so grateful for that. And then Mike and Jane Harper in Anchorage were very pleased to know of the project and very supportive too. So that's really meaningful for me too, that the family has been appreciative of the project and has that they feel that they appreciate the way that I've kind of reproduced his life story. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned a wifeless family was in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where she grew up?
Mm-hmm.
You know
Yes,
her?
so Germantown, Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Well,
Okay, yeah, so she descended from a long line of Episcopal pastors, and so she, an Episcopal family, and
what's her bloodline?
what?
She looked big.
I'm sorry?
She looked rather native.
I know, someone else, I never thought of that, but someone else pointed that out to me. I don't believe she had any Native American heritage.
There are
Yeah.
native.
Uh-huh. Yes,
Not that
of
far
course.
from
But I read nothing in the letters, in her letters, that indicated that. And in fact, I'm quite certain that if they had any Native heritage, they wouldn't have known of it, because there was just the tiniest issue, or there was fear of an issue that she was marrying a half Native man. But her father said right away that was not any issue. Nobody in the family had any issue with that, and they trusted Francis's good judgment and so on. And so I think that would have come out in her letters somehow if the family had. But I agree that her complexion looks just a little bit like she might have some Native American heritage.
What attracted my attention was maybe it was because of Carlisle, the native school.
Mm-hmm.
Not that far.
Okay, yeah,
That's all in the area where I'm from, and so it's always been on
okay,
my mind.
yeah.
But that's what was my first.
Yeah, okay. Nice, and I would like to point out what I didn't about Mount Hermon School. It differed quite strikingly from the industrial schools of the time. It was not a Native American school. It was a Christian-based boys' school, and it had a sister school, Northfield School for girls. And the schools were founded by the very famous evangelist Dwight Moody. And the student body was very, very diverse. They had a small percentage of Native American students, but what was so remarkable was they did not denigrate Native American culture whatsoever, or Native American languages. And in fact, rather than preparing Native American students or any students for the industries necessarily, they were really preparing Native American students in particular for the professions, so they would go back to their communities and could be sort of liaisons between Western culture and their own Native communities. So it was quite a different culture there at the school, and Hudson Stuck was very approving of that, and so several boys, at least boys, I'm not sure about girls, but several Alaska Native boys went to that school. Yes.
Mary, what did you come away? You spoke about how you feel about Mr. Harper. What did you think about Hudson Stuck? What did you come away with believing about him?
Yeah. So thanks for asking that, because so Hudson Stuck was a complicated figure. I am a huge fan of the guy, but I'm quite certain that if I had had to interact with him on a daily basis, I would have found it difficult. He was very, he had a forceful personality. He was very opinionated. He was quite abrasive. He got on basically everybody's nerves, well, all white people's nerves. He was an incredible advocate for Alaska Native peoples. He tried very, very hard to protect Alaska Native peoples from negative influences of the white migrants who were here. He was he very much promoted the bone dry law in Alaska, prohibition, mainly because he was so concerned about the very negative effects of of alcohol on Alaska Native peoples. And so there were white folks who were including the editor of the Daily Newsminer in Fairbanks, who just hated Hudson Stuck because of that, because they weren't for prohibition. But he was so concerned about the well-being of Alaska Natives. And in fact, there's this one poignant passage, well, he writes about it himself in one of his books, I've forgotten which one, but in any case, he's talking to a congregation at, it was in the Nupiat village, and he was telling the fathers, whatever you do, continue to teach your sons subsistence skills, and okay, a little bit sexist, you know, he didn't say the same thing to the moms, but okay, you know, it was back in the early 1900s, but he said, continue to teach your sons subsistence skills so that by and by, they will be able to support their families. And he said, sure, Western education is a good thing, but if you have to choose the one or the other, your traditional education is more important. So he was very, very strong on people maintaining those traditional subsistence life ways. He did want to bring the light of Christianity to the people, and so that's one of the main sort of theses of the book, I guess I would say, that I think it's so important for, well, the way I tell it to my students is that we as historians always want to complicate the narrative, and this very simplified version of history that, you know, missionaries were bad and Alaska Natives were innocent victims of missionaries who were ethnocentric and tried to wipe out the Alaska Native and the Alaska Native people and turn them into white, you know, images of themselves. That's just simply incorrect. And I mean, there were some very intolerant missionaries, of course, and there were some downright abusive missionaries. But there was this incredible variation among denominations and among individual missionaries. And the Catholic, yeah, I would have to say that in my experience, I would say the Catholics and the Moravians and the Episcopalians did the greatest work in documenting Native languages, in encouraging Alaska Natives to maintain their traditional lifeways, and so they were not those ones who were trying to just assimilate Alaska Natives into Western lifeways. Other churches did a less admirable job at that. So what do I think about Hudson Stuck? I admire him incredibly. He would have been hard to deal with on a daily basis, but I really admire his devotion to Alaska Native peoples. Yeah. You had your hand up.
Yes, this is an unpaid advertisement for the book. I personally have read it, and Gretchen has a copy right here. And it is really a good read. Once you start, you won't put it down.
Well, thank you.
It was good.
Oh, thank you. I'm so touched to hear that. It really means a lot to me to hear and to hear like specific details from people about what what passages were particularly resonated with them. I have one of my former students in the audience, Eleanor, here, and she earned a master's degree in Northern Studies, and she owns a dog mushing business, and she did wonderful work on the struggles of Alaska Native young Alaska Native men today. And one of the conclusions or discoveries that she made, a conclusion of her research, was that that having a sense of purpose and direction and identity is just so strong, is so important, and that so many young men today are sort of floundering and don't quite have that because they're getting so many mixed signals from society, from the media. And so as I was learning to know Walter and as I was writing this book, I thought about Eleanor a lot in her research, and then she wrote me a couple weeks ago and said, "Mary, I finished the book," and it did resonate with her. She recognized that yes, Walter had this sense of purpose and direction and identity, and that gave him this strength, that allowed him to learn to know and become comfortable in Western culture without losing an ounce of his Athabascan heritage and identity. And that's just, I think, so important for young people as they're trying to figure out who they are. To have a strong sense of one's own identity and to feel good about that is just super important. So thank you, Eleanor. Yes?
Did he ever develop a relationship with his father, Walter?
So his father, he never really knew his father. His father died, I think, when he was about 5 years old. It's kind of a tragic thing. Obviously, he was older, but he wasn't that old by today's standards. He was about 60 when he died of tuberculosis. And ironically, he died in 1898, just when it was entirely clear that he had been right all along about the potential of the Alaska and Yukon gold field, right? And so here, after all his hard work and so much of what he and his partners, McQuestion and Mayo, had done in set the groundwork for other prospectors who came in and made life easier for them. And so eventually, the discovery at the Klondike was made, and other discoveries too. But he never became rich off of all his prospecting. He made a living. He made a decent living, and was very well respected. And so Walter didn't know his father, but he was very proud of his father, and Hudson Stuck encouraged that. And so as they traveled, sometimes they would encounter an old-timer. And when the old-timer found out that this was Walter Harper, Walter might get to hear a story or two about his father. And Hudson Stuck was very pleased about that, he wrote, and encouraged Walter to be proud of his Irish heritage too. Yes, Randy?
So Hudson must have carried on in his teachings throughout the land. I'm wondering, he must have picked up other young men to go along with him. Do they not have such a flamboyant story that Walter does? Or
there were others who. So Arthur Wright preceded Walter as Hudson Stuck's assistant and interpreter and so on, and he has many descendants here in Alaska's interior who are very proud of his accomplishments. Then Johnny Fredson, who had manned the base camp on Denali, followed in Walter's footsteps. Moses, and he is quite well known. In fact, his granddaughter Diana Campbell has written some articles about him. And then Moses Cruikshank. And Johnny Fredson did a lot of, was faithful to the Episcopal Church and did a lot of work in the Episcopal Church and other good work in Alaska, and was very well respected in Alaska's interior. Moses Cruikshank also, he lived to a nice old age, and Bill Schneider wrote his life story, together with, it was a collaborative effort together with Moses Cruikshank. So The Life I've Been Living is a book about the life of Moses Cruikshank. So there were others, and their stories have been told in one way or another. A woman, Joyce, I think, Mackenzie, wrote a biography of Johnny Fredson, and then Bill Schneider, together with Moses Cruikshank, wrote his life story. But nobody had written Walter's life story at all until this, and so it just. I just felt so like I hit a gold mine when I discovered him. Yeah. There was another hand up over here somewhere.
You
Okay,
mentioned
yeah.
Mike Harper. I remember growing up with Mike, and I was curious where he ended up and what his bloodline connection to Walter was.
Okay, so he is the grandson of Sam Harper, who was the sibling, the brother, older. Okay, so let's look at the siblings here again. So Sam, who was Walter's favorite brother, probably because he knew him the best, because he was the closest in age to him. Walter, I didn't tell you, well, I didn't want to tell you everything, but Walter adored his sisters. He was very close to them, very, very close to him and them, and he wrote them the most wonderful letters when he was away at Mount Hermon, and those are just treasures, and those are some of the few documents that I have that are in Walter's hands. But then Sam, he said, was his favorite brother. And Sam and Louise had 10 children. And so Mike Harper is a descendant of Sam. And so he's a great nephew of Walter. And Mike Harper then and he and his wife Jane live in Anchorage. And Randy knows, did Randy just walk out? Pardon me, they played basketball together at Lathrop, I think. Mike's a little older than Randy's my brother. And so Phyllis Fast and Mike Harper and Johanna Harper are all grandchildren of Sam. Walter's next bigger brother. Yeah, Mike grew up here in Fairbanks and he played basketball at Lathrop back in the day.
Let's give her a round of applause.